start tonight, I want to introduce Karen. Karen, if you don't know, she's literally practically wrote books on content strategy for mobile, going responsive, both published by Open Heart, part of our canon for content strategy, and of course she continues to share her knowledge with presentations like tonight and from many other organizations and events like LavaCon next week. And all of this knowledge that she shared, I really feel like it helps to broaden my skill set personally, but also broaden really the understanding of what we do to even a larger audience beyond us. So really appreciate that. And all of the sharing of knowledge she does has really come from a lot of experience in the field. Since 2006, she's been co-founder and managing partner of Von Art and Science. And before that, she was the first ever information architect at Razorfish, leading there as the VP of a national lead for user experience. So lots of experience. She still finds time to share this and work with so many variety of clients from IBM, Marriott, Cisco, Disney, Citibank, and about every major publisher in the business, from Hearst, Atlantic, Fast Company, Crazy Blush, Timing, New York Times, and Condé Nast. If all this didn't keep her busy enough, still has found time to do a podcast with Ethan Marcotte, her responsive web design podcast, and maybe another coming up. We'll have to stay tuned, but I heard the last episode, so I'm anxiously awaiting what the future holds. But tonight, let's give Karen a warm welcome.
I am so happy to be here. I have lived in Philly for 2 years now. Can you believe this? It's great. I like you all. Okay, so I will talk a little bit. So I'm going to talk about content operations, which is one of those terms that I think is floating around the industry a little bit right now. And given that I can't pass the opportunity to poke at what's going on in the world of content, I have assembled what are essentially these are just my thoughts on things that I've seen in the world. This is the first time I've talked about this or done this talk, so I'm very much hoping if you have thoughts, opinions, if there's things that from your own perspective you want to share, that is the whole purpose of tonight. So just a little bit of background on me. I am an independent consultant. I have been for about 12 years now. I basically work with large, complicated enterprise companies on helping them fix their content problems. I do a lot of work in financial services, a lot of work in healthcare, so more on the hospital, medical device side. Big tech companies like the IBMs and the Ciscos of the world, anybody who has a massive content infrastructure problem, I like to get in there and try to help them out a little bit. I think that one of the things that I've learned in working with a range of different large enterprises is that I tend to see very similar types of problems emerge across businesses that are in, doing very different work or in, very different industries. But there's a core content challenge that happens when you are working at the scale of a big enterprise, where you have, hundreds of thousands of web pages, where you have a massive publishing infrastructure. Some of the types of things that emerge for these organizations are very consistent, and that's essentially where I'm coming up at this problem today. As Nicole helpfully mentioned, I'm the author of 2 books on content strategy or something similar. My first one, Content Strategy for Mobile, is really kind of a point of view on multi-device publishing. And my second book, Going Responsive, is less about responsive web design and more about organizational process, how do you change the way that you think about the work that you're producing when you're designing something that's going to live in lots of different contexts or on lots of different screen sizes. And from all of the work that I do, I think think, it's like I'm a problem filter. So I spend a lot of time doing full day working sessions with organizations, and if everybody will permit me the tiniest of pitches, if this is a topic or these sorts of things are of interest to you in a large organization, one of the things I really like to do is come in for a day and spend some time talking to the team, talking to executives, helping to hammer out what some of the problems are and what some of the goals are. I find that to be a really interesting and rewarding way to help a company filter through the kinds of problems that they have. And to me, a lot of these things are like that little grit of sand that eventually an oyster turns into a pearl. Like something good can emerge from those problems or from the ongoing effort of a company to try to solve for a nagging, painful thing that's like stuck in its craw. So a lot of what I'm talking about here today are things that have emerged for me over the last couple of years working with large-scale organizations where they talk about their problems in their own language, they talk about what their pain points are, and I sort of put things together in a way where I'm like, this is like that, is like that, is like that. I've heard this a bunch of times before. These are consistent things that are emerging from the terrain. Now, if you ever have those dreams where you're like, I don't know, presenting to a big group of people and you're naked? I have nightmares where I'm standing in front of a room of people, nice, good people, and I'm giving a talk where I have to do what's called defining the damn thing. You heard of this? Defining the damn thing is possibly the worst thing that the UX community can do to itself. It's like if you want to see a bunch of UX people just absolutely go batshit, ask them like what the definition of user experience is. What's the difference between UX and UI? And I really do not like being in a position of trying to stake a claim on a new term, a new language. Like, there's something about having to define content operations that makes me feel a little bit like, oh man, are we going to have like a whole branding exercise now around what content ops is, and is it different from content strategy? And now, while I very much do not want to be the person doing this, I do believe that there is some value in mature, responsible adults trying to tease apart a little bit about how the industry has changed, how we have grown, what's missing, where are there places where, as we have expanded the territory of what UX or information architecture or content strategy or just content in general, as we think about how that expands, where do we see missed opportunities or gaps or where things are missing? And so when I talk about content ops, I do not for a moment mean to be like, let's stake a new claim on some new UX term. What I mean is, let's be precise about the language that we're using, and let's try to identify places where the terms that we have used in the past may not fully encompass the work that we need to do in the future. So this is an old slide that I made years ago, and I really liked this slide. There was something, I think, useful about identifying marketing and UX and technology as like the big turf, the big silos that exist in organizations, and then identifying different ways that content can fit into that. So I tend to see, obviously, content management as a very strong technology discipline. Content marketing is, I guess people are familiar with content marketing. And then content strategy, I think, in my mind, filled this somewhat unusual role in the industry as being both sort of a discrete, smaller area within UX. So it's sort of like the content strategy people staking some ground within the user experience profession to say this is how we fit into the other disciplines that might be things like IA or user research or interaction design or whatnot. But there's also this sense that content strategy, at least in some people's callings, wanted to encompass the whole scope of what everything is. So there's pieces of content strategy that are really informing how content marketing works and informing how content management works. I then also tend to think that if you're thinking about content strategy as a discipline, there tend to be people who come more out of like an editorial background. Those people tend to sit more on the border between marketing and UX. And then there tend to be people that come out of what I would call more of a structural background, which is totally like my people, that are the people who are sort of filling in some gaps between what's going on in UX and what's going on with the actual technical implementation of a content management system. So, I did this a while back. I included it here just because I was like, that was a framing that seemed to work for me 5 years ago, and I think it maybe doesn't fully encompass the work that we're doing today. So let me take a second and just talk about a little bit of my point of view on what is content strategy, what is content management, and where are the gaps in between them. So if I were to describe content strategy, and good Lord, please don't put this on Twitter and say that this is the Karen McGrane official definition of what content strategy is, because I'll lose my mention, RIP my mentions. But if I was talking about content strategy, I would say, fundamentally it needs to be about an organization thinking carefully about how it plans for its content initiatives, what its goals are, how does it then execute those goals across content marketing tactics. So what are we actually producing? How does that come through in how we maybe allocate resources, or how we, what our vision is for, branded writing, editorial writing. How do we perceive our tone of voice? How do we, actually manage the work of copywriting, and how do we define what good copywriting is? It might include the more structural aspects of content, so things like information architecture and taxonomy and metadata. I think that's an area where there's still, I think, a bit of a gap in how that gets executed, and I see that a lot in the content management space. And then I think content strategy is also trying to stake a claim around governance. People like Lisa Welchman, I think, have done phenomenal work on talking about what governance is. I think there's a lot of industry-wide confusion about the idea that we are using the term content strategy to refer to a whole package of activities, of which not all of them are strategy. And I'm so not the person to complain about which particular words we use. Like, is content strategy really strategy? If it served us well for a few years, that's fine. It's a term we got people to rally around. But I think we might be at a point in the industry where we need to say more clear delineation around what is actually strategy versus what is, dare I say it, ongoing operations. Would probably be healthy for how enterprises think about and plan their work. This quote from Richard Lavelle, who writes about strategies, where he says, a good strategy is a set of actions that is credible, coherent, and focused on overcoming the biggest hurdles of achieving a particular objective. I think that's a nice summary of one type of problem that we in the content space should solve. This nice lady, Julie from Facebook, kind of broke down this point a little bit more in a Medium post that she wrote, where she basically says, okay, so what does it mean that we're going to achieve a particular objective? Well, it means that it should be clear what success looks like, and the organization should be able to rally around a definition of what success looks like. I would say that if we, as content strategists, are holding ourselves to even this one bullet point as a standard, I don't think we're doing a very good job. I think that it may be that content marketing as a practice has become such a, it's like the goal is to do something, and then you do something, and people look at it, and so you were successful. I don't know that actually is a good strategic definition of success. So I don't necessarily think that for an organization to say, well, we have a blog and people like our blog, people come to our blog, so obviously our blog is successful. Well, I mean, yeah, I want to believe that is successful purely from a marketing standpoint, Like, did you get your brand message in front of people? Yes. Does that actually mean that that content is doing its job for you, that you have a clear definition of what successful content looks like as compared to, you know, just content that you're publishing for the sake of publishing it? I don't necessarily think that we do. So beyond that, then, next point is that there's a set of actions. I think that a lot of times some of the strategic work that gets put together is not necessary, because there isn't a clear picture of a goal, there's not always a concrete plan for how to get there. There may be a concrete plan for creating and publishing content, but not necessarily an iterative process for evaluating whether those concrete actions are going to result in the goal. Beyond looking at things like page views, or beyond looking at other like basic metrics that we can evaluate. Is the plan credible and coherent? I think one point that Julie makes here is that there should not be conflicting pieces of the plan. And I would say I would be hard pressed to name a large enterprise that I thought had a credible, coherent content strategy at the enterprise level for which there were no conflicting pieces of the plan. In fact, I think that the siloing and competitive nature of a lot of the content creation and the duplication of content creation results in perhaps an individual group or an individual silo developing a plan that for them is credible and coherent, but yet is not actually something that isn't being competed with across the organization. Like, just as an example, and you know, this is somewhat abstract, but I have worked with some organizations that have made a point of going out to really reach the millennial audience. Millennials, the kids these days, we gotta do something, we gotta talk to them differently, we gotta produce content that the millennials are gonna like. Okay, I mean, sure, okay, let's go along with that. So you get a separate silo in the organization set up that is off spinning up microsites and writing different content and taking some core materials and adapting them in a tone or a style that they believe will be more palatable to the younger generation. And so as a result, the metrics by which they are evaluated are narrowly defined in such a way that they can achieve their goal of performing better than the existing content, let's say, that was not at all millennial focused. You know, they can go back with some very clear metrics to say, yes, you know, this content, when we put it in front of people in their 30s, people in their 30s look at it more than they look at the stuff on our website. Is that successful for the organization? Yeah, I mean, it is. It's like, if you say that's the terms by which we are going to define success, then they are successful. If you say the goal of this initiative is to make our entire publishing infrastructure more successful or more efficient, the goal of our initiative is for you to bring insights that you have learned from this process back to the larger organization so that we all do a better job, I don't think that we're successful in that broader scope of what it really means to be successful. And I think it's because there are often competing objectives where one group is like, I want to make my microsite good, and another group is like, we want to make the website good. And those two people are just duplicating effort or even competing. And then last, this plan needs to be focused on overcoming the biggest hurdles. So I think this is, you know, the reason that I wanted to put this up here is to say, I think that in many cases, organizations fall apart when they are forced to confront the number of hurdles that they face in getting to where they want to be. So, you know, out here is this vision for what our content should be doing or how we're going to connect with customers. And then the plan needs to take us through so many painful, complicated steps of dealing with legacy system, of dealing with writers that, you know, need to adapt their workflow, of dealing with technology that has not kept pace, dealing with executives who want to buy their way out of a problem. And the plans that we put in place are a little too hopeful, a little too lacking in credibility and coherence to actually focus on overcoming the specific hurdles. And so what I would hope to see for organizations is, as we move into, you know, another decade of content strategy, or another decade of really trying to take a UX focus on what content should be, that we can also have a clearer-eyed look at what some of these hurdles are and what some of these challenges will be, so that we can put plans in place to solve for them. So let's talk about content management for a second. So on the flip side of the equation is this massive multi-bajillion-dollar industry called content management that encompasses the tools and the technology that we put in place to support publishing, content storage, management, asset management, but then also I think the workflow and sort of editorial processes around how we deal with that content. So that might be things like business logic, rules for personalization, or other business rules that would help guide, what is something, how does it get used. It might mean all of the massive infrastructure around all of the different legacy systems and other tooling that organizations put in place to manage their process. Here's a nice little diagram about what enterprise content management is. So if you can read that, it's got things like, it's got business process, collaboration, imaging, building a portal, knowledge management, digital rights management, web content management. Like there's a set of stuff that is in many ways very mature within the enterprise. What this nice simple diagram does not fully get into is the discussion of MarTech. You heard this term, MarTech? It gives me the heebie-jeebies every time I hear it. So the idea of MarTech is basically this assumption that we have technology that is designed to help somebody communicate with a customer. Here's a quote from a guy who's an expert in MarTech, where someone asked him what MarTech is, and he said, every piece of technology a marketer uses to reach a potential customer is MarTech, which is accurate and yet perhaps not entirely communicative answer. But what MarTech then winds up meaning is, here's the kind of diagram they get when somebody's talking about what their MarTech is. Can you imagine the poor intern that had to assemble this giant diagram with all the logos on it? I know this is totally unreadable. Let's just take one little piece of this enormous diagram in which they talk about what content and customer experience is. So they say this is mobile apps, interactive content, video marketing, email marketing, content marketing, digital asset management, market resource management, SEO, marketing automation, campaign lead management, and way, way down at the very bottom, content management system and web experience management. Now, you look at some giant ecosystem map like this, and it does frighten me a bit for the state of MarTech. But I think what this, to me, says about the industry is that there are a lot of pieces of technology that exist solely so that robots can talk to other robots, servers can talk to other servers. Those are put in place in an effort to try to automate and optimize things where the fundamental human understanding of the content strategy, the goals of the content, and the quality of the content are not there. And that none of these tools, none of this landscape is going to help you build a strategy or identify your goals and a plan for how to get there if you don't have that in place in your organization to start. And so this is where it's, start to question so what is operations and where does this fit into this mix? In my research, in which I looked at the definition of operations on the first page of Google search results, I found that a lot of them were not very good. This one says that it's the planning, development, publishing, and management of content for the achievement of strategic business goals. And what I would really like is to have a definition for content operations that is distinctive and unique and differentiated from our definition of everything else that we do. So if everything we're talking about is just one big blob of, well, we need to produce content and have it be strategic and then manage it, that's not a good enough definition. This one also, the set of processes, people, and technologies for strategic planning, producing, distributing, and analyzing content, not specific enough. Let's get to a place where we can talk about what content ops is that's different from content strategy or management. let's turn to my dear friend Dean Barker, who always has smart things to say. If you don't follow Dean, he writes a blog at Gadgetopia, and he definitely knows more about content management than any human being in the world really should have the right to know. So what he says is that content operations is bookended by content strategy and technical content management services. So content ops is the glue between the plan for the content and the CMS in which it's managed and delivered. Now this, I think, is a good working definition of what content operations is. And it kind of goes back to my point about, a little bit of sprint in an oyster eventually becomes a pearl. I think that in trying to articulate where are the missing pieces, like what is it that isn't getting done between the plan for the content and the CMS, that I think is an opportunity to try to define where organizations' pain points are and then hopefully be able to say, here's how we'll fix them. So let's work with this definition of content ops to begin with. But I would be remiss in talking about operations here if I didn't acknowledge that what this really is the organization, the industry sort of piling on around the development of development ops, or DevOps, design ops. I've heard of research ops, we're going to have content ops. Soon there's going to be ops for everything. And while this may seem trendy, I think that there are some lessons to learn from particularly what people say about where DevOps came from and how that might have led to other facets of the work that we do, trying to call operations out as a thing that needs to get done. Dave Maloof just did an interview for a podcast for an organization called Aurelius, in which he talked about design ops and research ops. And he said that what operations are is always those elements outside of the actual practice that are required to support the practice to happen. So I think if you're talking about design ops or research ops, those might be more tactical things that need to exist so as to facilitate the work of design or the work of research. DevOps is actually a little bit more specific, and I found some of the explanations of where DevOps came from and why it exists to be pretty relevant to some of the challenges that I see in content strategy. So DevOps essentially arose, and trust me, I'm still not the expert on DevOps, so if you need more than these 4 bullet points of explanation, I'm not the person to go to for it, but where DevOps arose from is that the teams that were responsible for actually doing development were different from the teams that were responsible for deploying and maintaining the code. And so that siloing often led to organizations where the 2 different teams had different incentives. They were managed to different sets of goals. In some cases, those were competing goals. And it meant that both teams weren't really doing their best work because they weren't aligned in their ambitions. So DevOps as a practice essentially said, what if we try to align our efforts by using a technology stack and tooling, which will enable us to do what's sometimes called continuous deployment. We want to make sure that these teams are eating their own dog food in some sense, like they're using the same tooling and the same infrastructure to create the site as they're going to use to maintain it. And as they're deploying things all the time, that means that they have to build in additional infrastructure to make that happen. So the result is that over time, the tooling gets to a place where people can go off and do something that previously would have required a development team to support them. And things can be automated in ways like ongoing testing, for example, that previously couldn't be automated that way. Now, when I read something like this, I get kind of excited for what that might mean if we had similar infrastructure in place for content. So what would happen if the organization was aligned in such a way that the people who were responsible for creating the content were more closely aligned with the teams that were responsible for the tooling or the technology, the infrastructure that was going to publish and manage that content? What would happen if the development team saw it as their fundamental responsibility to put tooling in place that would allow people to achieve things independently rather than having to bring a development team in? Like, what if that was one of the standards that we were operating toward? What kind of research or analytics or instrumentation would we have in place if we expected the tools that we create to constantly be doing automated testing on the content itself to evaluate whether that content was doing its job or not? What would it mean for the life of everybody who worked on that team if the responsibility for some of those decisions, we brought the actual tooling into place so that they could have better insight about the content, they could automate tasks that previously couldn't be automated, and the idea was that they would have more power to produce content or update things in the technology itself without having to bring the development team in. This history of DevOps, and I won't read this all to you, but it comes from Atlassian. And they said two interesting things in this that I thought were really kind of relevant to this. So they said that developers and IT ops professionals had separate and often competing objectives, separate department leadership, separate KPIs by which they were judged, and often they worked on separate floors or even in separate buildings. And so as a result, the teams were siloed, they were only concerned with their own functions, their own fiefdoms, and as a result, they worked longer than they had to, they had unhappy customers, and everything wound up being a death march project. So with the rise of DevOps, what they found was that if you're struggling to get, are you struggling to get code out the door without there being a lot of drama? And I'm like, well, what if you just took all of the places in this description where you said code and crossed it out and wrote content in? Are you still struggling with silos among teams where you can't get new content out or you can't deploy updates to your system without there being a lot of drama? Do you have IT teams and content creation teams or marketing teams that are working at cross purposes because their goals are not aligned on everybody understanding that the responsibility is to deliver the best content possible for the customer and for having tools and mechanisms in place to make that happen? There's a lot of history here from other disciplines that I think is incredibly relevant to some of the types of problems that I see organizations struggling with. So let's talk about three things that I think I would include as part of content ops. So the first one would be org structure. The second would be having ongoing investment, and the third one would be having more effective ways to evaluate what success means. And when I list this out, I don't mean that I think this is the full scope of what I think content operations is. The good team at Gather Content is doing a webinar on content operations tomorrow. If you're not familiar with Gather Content, I would go check them out. They are launching, or they have launched a new version of their platform that they're calling a content operations platform. And in their telling of it, they are talking about a lot of the ongoing processes like doing an inventory and an audit of your content, gathering content from stakeholders and managing the editorial process and the workflow around making that happen. All of those I think are absolutely things that we could talk about as part of content operations versus content strategy versus content management. All of those are sort of like bread and butter content activities. Here, I wanted to take a look at, if I thought an organization actually had content operations in place, what would be different? What are the things that we don't have today or I see organizations still continuing to struggle with? And if I had to make a list of what those three things are, it's these three things. So they struggle with having an org structure that is appropriate for managing their content. They lack commitment and ongoing investment in content resources beyond just content creation. And they don't have a clear picture of what success would look like, nor do they have particularly good ways of evaluating whether they have, how close are they to their goal. So let me talk about each one of these in turn. Let's talk about org structure first. Some see things as they are, and they say, why? I dream things that never were and ask, why not? This could be variously a quote attributed to George Bernard Shaw. It was the central thesis of Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign. This idea of, why do we have to focus so much on what's wrong with what we have today? Couldn't we envision a better future? I think that when people, smart people, reasonable people, talk about content structure, there's this sense that siloing and the fragmented work structure that most organizations wrestle with is just the landscape that we deal with. You know, it's like, I'm fond of saying, like, you have to be able to look your problems in the eye and say, yep, that's my problem. That's one of the problems I have, is a decentralized, fragmented org structure. There's a part of me, sitting here, giving a talk about what I think this should be, that believes that it's time to give some large enterprises a big wake-up call around the idea that if they're suffering through problems of competing objectives, lack of a definition of success, no clear goals, the root cause of that, or the root solution to that, is not going to happen at a lunch and learn. It's going to happen by actually having senior executive buy-in for doing some restructuring of the organization so that a larger percentage of the content is owned by the same team or a similar organization, that all of the writers or all of the people who are producing content are being held to the same objectives, and their tasks can be better aligned. And what that means is that, yeah, you probably need to do some kind of reorg in order to make that happen. I think that, so if I had to summarize the problems here, no one owns content strategy. You might have somebody who says they own content strategy, but they really don't. Content management is still often thought of as an IT function, and so the IT team does not have any incentive or KPIs around ensuring content quality or ensuring that the content is meeting customer needs. They may not even really have any particular incentives around improving the publishing infrastructure. So, I'll hear things a lot like, yeah, so if we want to update the CMS, we got to file a ticket. The IT team has their own priorities, and so, our needs get put into a queue, and we decide 6 months later that ticket might get filled. If you've heard of MarTech, I think fundamentally when people talk about MarTech, the intent is to recognize that there are customer-facing technologies that should be under the purvey of the marketing group and not necessarily beholden to the infrastructure and the development timelines of the IT team, which has all sorts of other things to manage. It's one thing to call it MarTech, and it's another thing to actually put the org structure or the infrastructure into place to make that happen. And the organizations that I like working with the most, the ones where I feel like I have the most productive conversations, are the ones that have just done some sort of reorg to say, we've got to focus on content, and that means that we are treating someone in the marketing team as having enough seniority so that they can be a peer to someone on the IT team who's responsible for content management. And oftentimes that means that there's going to, the reorg on the marketing side means that writers who have previously been working in lots of different groups coalesce into one group reporting up into one person. A similar but related theme on this is that when you look at how writers or other content resources are assigned within the organization, they're very commonly siloed into specific channels or platforms. So you have a PR team, you have an email team, you have a web team, you have an app team, and you have a support team. That basically ensures, you have a print team. That basically ensures that, for example, the people who are writing for print have no incentive to try to think about creating content for digital. It means that the team that's producing content for the email newsletter is not necessarily thinking about how that content, whatever they're producing, could be reused in other places. They don't have a holistic picture of customer tasks in a, quote, omni-channel way. But rather, they have people who are narrowly focused within their own silo on doing well within their silo. So if your responsibility is the email newsletter or the millennial microsite, you will achieve your goals in that specific silo, but may not be held to broader goals across the organization. What that means then is that there's no incentive to reuse content. And I would say that probably every organization that has ever hired me has at one point or another called me up to say, we have a lot of content that's being produced here. There's a lot of things that are overlapping or that we could be more consistent on, but we have teams working in lots of different groups who are producing their own things, and there's no, it just gets created and recreated. I would love to blame the content management system for that problem, and I have done my darndest for the last 5 years to blame the CMS, but it's not necessarily the CMS's fault. It's an org structure problem. And so what that means is that teams are very, very manually reusing content. So you're literally copying and pasting it from one thing, putting it at someplace else, maybe editing it slightly. There's no version control. There's no streamlined reuse at all. It's just a painful, cumbersome process. And I really want to believe that that can be better. It's like, I feel like I've spent most of my life trying to bang on that one particular problem, and I'll probably be doing it until I retire, but I just want to see if there's some way to help organizations not, reinvent the wheel every time they got to put an email newsletter out. But more than that, what that means is that organizations don't have a good picture of what content effectiveness is. So, many clients, after we've been in an engagement, we're getting to know each other, we're finally getting down to brass tacks, and they'll finally just stare at me and be like, we don't actually know what our customers want from our content. We have the stuff that we publish, there's things we have to publish, but what does anybody want from us? Is there something out there that we could be doing that would be better? And we don't know what that is or even how we would figure that out. And I think that problem, not being able to identify what our strategic goal is and then not being able to have any mechanisms in place to track whether the content that we're producing is actually helping us achieve our goal, you might not think that that's an org structure problem, but I do think it's an org structure problem. Because if you've got a team producing print materials and a team producing email newsletters and a team generating content for an app, you don't actually have a picture of what that customer is doing, and you don't know, is any of it actually doing its job for you? And then last but not least, and I think this is probably the core of the problem, nobody wants to change the way they work. They don't want to change their tools. They don't want to change their workflow. They don't want to work with any strangers. They most certainly do not want to give up Microsoft Word. I'm going to pry Microsoft Word from their cold, dead hands. And so it becomes very difficult to talk about content in the same way that I think you can talk about design and development. I see a lot of organizations that are reorging their design team, spending a lot of time talking about design tooling and design systems and what sort of resources we put in place so that our designers aren't starting from scratch every time and that we're consistent across platforms. We're not there with content, and I think the root cause of it is that until you see similar changes happening at the org structure level, similar changes happening at the mid-senior level executive role, this doesn't get fixed. So that means that you wind up with teams siloed into lots of different teams. You have marketing, PR, sales, support, little to no incentive to collaborate. You get platform-specific teams with little content reuse. You can't organize around, even if you could identify what the most important user tasks are as relates to content. So if someone is coming to your website with a question in mind and you want to be able to give them an answer to a complex problem, you've just been diagnosed with some medical condition and you want to go in and try to understand that concept, the team may not necessarily be organized around helping you achieve that task. They may be organized around helping you sign up for that email newsletter so that they can go to their boss and say, look, we increased signups by 36% this month. And so the level of effort and the messaging can vary widely across teams. So for example, it is very, very common for me if I go into an organization to encounter people who are, quote, creating content in all of these different roles. So you'll have product people, so those are like, sometimes those are the business people or the subject matter experts that are responsible for saying, you know, here's our widget, here's the bullet points about the widget, this is what we want to say about our widget. You will also see in the age of content marketing, in many cases, a whole brand editorial team. So a completely separate group that, say, runs the blog. That may also include people from the print side. So I work with lots of organizations that are still producing magazines and white papers and brochures and sales decks. And so you have a lot of writers that are responsible for that work. You may have now a new set of writers coming in, a new pod of UX, what we're now calling UX writers, transactional writers, you know, people who are responsible for product interface, microcopy. And then you'll often have a whole PR team that's also creating a bunch of content aimed at a specific audience, but they're churning out press releases. And that's just on the marketing side. If you go look at the support side, you also have a team of people that are accessing a repository of content resources and communicating those content resources to the customer. So that whether that's on the phone or via chat or email or even now through audio, voice-based systems, the organization needs to have a repository of content that is accessible to those support resources. That content needs to be accurate, it needs to reflect the same messaging that they would find if they went to go look for it on the website or in the app or whatever, and they need for the whole organization to be able to act on or influence what that content is. So this is, in many cases, it's dozens, if not hundreds of writers across a large-scale enterprise, most of whom are working, to some degree within their own silo, very channel-specific, and not only don't have a lot of incentive to collaborate, for example, to get the print team to start producing the additional metadata required to deliver the content online. They don't necessarily see that as an organizational goal. They see that as the digital team coming in and saying, you have to do more work so that our work can be successful. That's just not healthy for an organization. Like the idea that we still have content resources, content teams competing for resources with each other, to say like, who gets more time, print or digital. It's like if I were a CEO or if I was going to talk to a CEO, that's the one thing I would want them to understand, is the extent to which you have cross-functional teams across your organization who are competing with each other for resources to deliver the right message to the client, rather than having a streamlined point of view on what those messages should be and how you're going to get them out. That's wasted money. Like you're just spending money on having your teams fight with each other when you could be spending money on making their process better. This quote, John Ekman, he runs a development shop in Boston called 10 Up. He was at a conference where he said, this is talking about org structure. So the woman who's the head of NBC Sports said that structure needs to follow strategy, not the other way around. And that too often organizations are structured based on the channel or based on the media, rather than based on how customers think. And so I think this is true for every large enterprise. If it's NBC Sports, they're wrestling with things like, how do we deal with cross-channel, quote, cannibalization as a customer wants to come in and watch the Olympics on TV, on their phone, on cable, on the web. How do we think about that as an organization so that we're delivering the best customer experience, but not necessarily pitting TV against digital, because that's not healthy for the organization or healthy for the customer. Same thing with like the banks or the hospitals that I deal with. How do they ensure that the infrastructure that we put in place incentivizes teams to work with each other and encourages them to say, let's reuse this content, let's not reinvent the wheel here, rather than everybody just going off and doing their own bespoke thing. Okay, so the next one, ongoing investment. This is like, I guess it's like, if you're going to call something operations, what that suggests is that it has an ongoing budget and you have committed to paying for it over the long term. I think that probably fundamentally the big challenge that I see a lot of content work having is that it's still treated as if it's like a short-term or project-based thing. So, somebody brings me in for a short-term project, that's great. I like to think that I can add some value in helping them frame the work that they're going to do, but it's not something where you don't just get it done and say, well, it's so great that we finished that content management system project. Now we never have to think about our CMS again. But yet, I have seen so many projects that run exactly that way. Like, there's this frantic desire to get all of the features built into the CMS before the development team goes away. Because if you don't get it all done, then everything will have to be managed as like a help ticket in the future, and you don't actually get the long-term strategic thinking and the ongoing refinement that it should have. I think that every organization that, it's like if you're a big enterprise, I want to know what the budget is, not for you to hire somebody like me to come in for a short term and like set you on the right path. I want to know what is your budget for ongoing improvements to editorial process, to workflow, to taxonomy, to the content management system itself. Like, not just in a IT, like let's add new features, but let's refine this. Let's look at what's not working, what doesn't make sense, how can we make this better for people? The questions of not just about the content, but about the content process itself, the content operations itself. I want some way that the organization is feeding back into itself all the time. Like, how do we know if this is working? How are we going to make this better? And right now, I think most organizations are still operating in a place where it's like, we built you a CMS, now you're going to suffer through it for 10 years. We're going to hire for people who are willing to put up with it. We're going to hire for people who are willing to like figure things out and, get their duct tape and baling wire out and get everything to hold together, rather than saying, like, this is so important to the functioning of our business that we're not going to succeed without ongoing continual investment and refinement. Are we doing anything good? Is this working for us? And I think that just content as a whole, I think because we can get access to some data, everybody just stops there. I think that probably the least effective task that we have on the internet is, the least effective promise that we make to anybody is learn more. Did you really learn more? Did you? The idea that so much of what we publish isn't necessarily, it's task-based, but it's task-based in the sense of, did you want to know something? Why did you come to this website? Well, you wanted to learn more about something. Did you actually learn more? Did that information make it into your head in a way that was accurate and allowed you to do something with it? That is such a fundamental question that I just do not think we ask. What we ask instead are, did somebody get to this page? Have they seen it? Could you find what you were looking for? If we asked you, to find information about lung cancer treatments, could you get to the proper page on the website where we talk about lung cancer treatments? Excellent question. I'm not saying we shouldn't ask that, but I would really like to have a better picture of, are we asking people what information made it into their head? What do they think and feel and do after they've read that content? Did that content actually deliver on the promise of learning more, or did it deliver on the expectation that the user had when they came to that page? And I think that we do this to some extent. I think that in some ways we might have mechanisms in place to try to ask that question. But I think for 80, 90% of the content that we publish, we don't ask that question at all. Like, there's just this assumption of, well, we publish these things on the website because these are the things that we publish. And if someone can find them, or if someone looks at them, or if we feel like that content is performing the way we said it was going to, that's all we need to know. And I just feel so strongly that knowing some data about whether someone looked at your webpage or got your email or not does not answer the fundamental question of, did it get into their brain? Did they learn anything from it? Do they think better of you as an organization? Like, is there some positive outcome that will result from them having read that content? You know, I just think that we, like as the UX profession as a whole, we don't have good enough ways of talking about information seeking as a task. So I got my start in this industry a very long time ago doing usability tests of printed manuals. So I think there are mechanisms in place where teams used to do more usability evaluation of content itself. So not just could somebody find the right page in the manual where we describe how to, you know, change your printer driver settings, but could they actually do the thing as a result? Do they understand what we told them to do when they read that? And I think today we don't talk about information seeking as a task in the same way that teams would talk about other transactional tasks. So, you know, there's a clear sense of usability tests, and I bet everybody's organization does usability tests on, you know, can you move money from checking into saving? Do you understand how to complete this particular document or form? Can you do what thing? But we don't actually look at the task of, did you learn more? Did you understand the thing? And that's where I just feel like we need a better research methodology in place. Like if we're gonna have content ops, a big part of that content ops is an ongoing research methodology that goes beyond just looking at analytics data to actually looking at and talking to people about what they're doing. So, you know, I think that I would love to see organizations doing a lot more, like think aloud protocols of their content itself. I would love to see people doing more surveys or, you know, other like research to identify, like, did somebody retain the information that you wanted them to retain? Do they remember anything about you after, you know, if you send it a survey the following day, do they remember who you were at all? Do they remember what you told them? Did anything make it through their thick skull? And I think instead, we just get so focused on delivering against a narrowly defined goal that we set for ourselves. So, for example, I will see a lot of organizations that have invested in content marketing, and you know that's great. So they're publishing content, and you ask them about their traffic, and it turns out that most of their traffic is bought. Like they're buying their traffic from paid search and then directing people to this page, and it just becomes this like self-fulfilling prophecy of like, well, we published this content, and then we paid people to go look at it, and then they went and looked at it, and we've achieved our objectives of getting X amount of traffic to it, and so it's successful. Again, I want better for us as an industry than that. So, as I said, I'd like to see organizations think about doing like remote think-aloud protocols. So, you know, do ongoing user research where you're sitting people down, you know, at their computer at home and asking them to talk out loud as they read your content and tell you what information they're picking up, what's hard for them, what do they understand. I think, you know, from doing a lot of usability tests in my life, I have learned that there's probably no better way to convince an organization there's a problem than, you know, showing them the video of customers struggling to understand. So much of that has been done in a really task transactional way, but not enough on the content side. To work on, or whether their content is succeeding, they're not they're not doing an extremely complex task that involves them jumping from system to system. And I think if I were to ask a lot of people, like, if I were to show you a page of content on your website, and you had to answer the question of, is this content doing its job? Is it performing for you? And I wanted you to show me how you find the answer to that. It would involve somebody jumping from a complicated spreadsheet to some obtuse analytics tool to digging around in the CMS. And that's a huge amount of cognitive overhead. Different places what you would need to do if you ever wanted to deliver something personalized. So it's worth asking, like hypothetically, what would need to be true if we actually wanted to deliver a personalized experience? Like, what data would we need to have in place? Like, what questions would we need to ask about how someone wanted to interact with us or what information they needed. To me, the only answer to that is that it can't be entirely an editorial point of view about, oh, well, this is our brand and this is what we talk about. It's got to be rooted in really insightful research and data about what customers want, what they're looking for, what they do after they've read it, so that, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, when we get to that magical Star Trek computer place, when you ask the computer a question, it gives you a relevant answer and not just the closest thing that we have. This is the kind of thing that keeps me up nights, is just sort of trying to think through, if you had an organization that actually thought it could personalize its content, personalize its content by, people's account data or based on a medical diagnosis, what would you need to do to have that in place? And to me, it comes back to all of these things about infrastructure. Like, you've got to have those processes in place, you have to have the tooling in place, and you have to have the insight about what people want. Okay, in conclusion, we're bad at content management, but that's okay, because we all have jobs, and I don't think that this problem is going to be going away anytime in my lifetime, and that's great because I like this problem. So perhaps if we start calling it operations, organizations will realize that they have to invest in it in an ongoing way and care about it as opposed to just being a short-term thing. And last but not least, as much as I would love to be able to turn all of our content problems over to the AI robots, I believe that robot uprising is a long time away. The robots will not save us, and so perhaps this operations mindset will help us get there.
$2 worth of